strange and mysterious world of terror at Collinwood. 'Tis I, Penny Dreadful, reluctantly relinquishing the reins to my dreaded doppelganger Danielle. Hey, welcome to Terror at Collinwood. I'm so happy you could join me. I have the next installment of the Dark Shadows podcast of questions and answers for you, inspired by Dale Clark's Dark Shadows books of questions and answers that were published back in the day. And I look forward to presenting these questions and answers to you. Before we get to the show, I have a few announcements here. Jump on over to YouTube and check out this amazing new Terror at Collinwood advertisement created by incredible monster artist Paul Garner. Thank you to John Logan for introducing me to Paul. He's an incredibly talented artist, and this very cool ad will be appearing in the fall/Halloween issues of Rue Morgue magazine, Scary Monsters magazine, Scream magazine, Castle of Frankenstein, and Monster Mag. It's definitely going to be a monster mash this Halloween. I love Paul's very Jack Davis inspired style, and I even had it printed up as a poster, which I've been using in the background of the Terror at Collinwood episodes. So make sure you grab an issue of Rue Morgue, Scary Monsters magazine, Scream magazine, Castle of Frankenstein, or Monster Mag to check out the new Terror at Collinwood ad. Speaking of great designs, have you gotten your Terror at Collinwood t-shirt yet? Designed by my amazingly talented friend Eric Marshall. They're available now at the Penny Dreadful the 13th T Public shop, and they feature great designs. Several listeners/viewers have sent in photos of their t-shirts, and you can see that in the video version of this episode. If you got a shirt and you want your picture shown in the video version of Terror at Collinwood, send me your picture wearing your shirt or hanging on a hanger, however you want to do it. Send it to terroratcollinwood@gmail.com and I will show it in a future video episode. In addition, there are many designs in the shop for my hosted horror show, Shilling Shockers. A variety of talented artists created designs for Shilling Shockers over the years, and several of those are available on the TeePublic site. You can get them on t-shirts, mugs, tote bags, whatever you want. In fact, I just added a new Penny Dreadful t-shirt design as a companion to the design featuring my snarling darling Guru. Both of those are by my very talented friend Donald David, who did two versions of the Penny design, one inside the full moon and the other in front of it. So grab your shirts over at tpublic.com/user/Penny Dreadful Roman numeral 13 XIII. I'll put a link in the show notes. In other news, Catherine Lee Scott has been added to New Jersey's massive horror convention, Chiller Theater. She'll be appearing from October 25th through the 27th. As previously announced, Kate Jackson will also be appearing at Chiller that weekend. It's still unclear whether Catherine and Kate will be sitting next to each other, since Chiller is a huge convention, but you can meet both of these ladies of the shadows at this epic event. Catherine Lee Scott and Kate Jackson at the same convention. Can you believe it? Well, it's happening. I'll put a link to Chiller Theater in the show notes. And finally, 3 more ladies of Dark Shadows will be appearing at the Sleepy Hollow International Film Festival in Tarrytown, New York on Saturday, October 12th at 1:30 p.m. In addition to a Q&A with Marie Wallace, Sharon Smith-Lentz, and Donna Wandry, Mary O'Leary will be screening a video recording of David Selby's reading of Jonathan Frid's letters, which he performed at the Dark Shadows Remembrance Weekend back in July. So you don't want to miss that one either. An East Coast Dark Shadows event happening in Tarrytown at Sleepy Hollow. It seems to me like it's going to be a very Dark Shadows Halloween. You think? I think so. Anyway, let's get to the show. Be careful, my friend, where you tread. for I warn you now, there are spoilers ahead. I just want to do a quick follow-up to episode 95, Why Dark Shadows Ended, which I did with Mary O'Leary, and we really went deep into that one. But Stuart Manning emailed me and reminded me of one thing that I completely forgot to mention, which was the fact that Art Wallace sued Dan Curtis at around the time House of Dark Shadows came out. And I remember reading this in one of the Dark Shadows Files magazines back in 1986. It was an interview between Ed Gross and Art Wallace. And in that interview, Art Wallace does mention suing Dan Curtis, and he says about the same time as the movie House of Dark Shadows. By that time, a couple of paperbacks had been published and the movie was about to be released. And I had my agent get in touch with him and ask what happened to my royalty on these projects because they were using my material. He felt that I had no right to any of it. And then Ed asks, and you won that one? He says, yeah. And then Ed asked, did that include the merchandising and all? And Art Wallace replied, I sued him on all these bases and we resolved it by him making a lump sum payment. He wouldn't talk to me after that, ever. So this was an interview with Art Wallace. I want to do a little more research on that, and Stuart's going to be coming on soon, so we may discuss it in that episode. But I think this constitutes yet another reason why Dan Curtis got fed up with Dark Shadows. Basically, this was just another nail in the proverbial coffin. Incidentally, in this same interview, Art Wallace claims that Dark Shadows became camp after he left the show, and he also takes credit for creating Barnabas, and neither of those things are true. To my knowledge, Art Wallace was long gone by the time Barnabas came around, so that's an odd claim. But the lawsuit did happen, and I am going to look into that a little bit more. But if you have not yet listened to episode 95 of the podcast, I highly encourage you to do so if you are interested in knowing why Dark Shadows ended. We don't have all of the pieces of the puzzle in that episode, but I think we got the key ones. But I think the Art Wallace lawsuit probably added to Dan's frustrations, and maybe ABC's as well. All right, I have several questions lined up here. Some I got off the internet. Some were emailed to me by listeners, and others I just whipped up on my own. I conjured them out of my cauldron using the Leviathan book. All right, first question. How did Roxanne become a vampire in 1840 before Barnabas and Julia went back in time and changed events? So I think I may devote an episode to what I think originally happened in 1840 before the past was changed by Barnabas and Julia. When it comes to Roxanne, my feeling is that Gerard, possessed by the warlock Judah Zachary, is the one who originally turned her into a vampire. During the summer of 1970, there seems to be some unspoken connection between the ghost of Gerard and the vampire Roxanne. In fact, the ghost of Gerard/Judah appears just as Sebastian Shaw is about to destroy Roxanne and stops him. She seems to be part of his grand plan. And I imagine that they were somehow in cahoots in 1840 as well. The other possibility is a bit of a mind bender, and it's that Barnabas was always the one who turned Roxanne into a vampire. He just didn't know it yet in 1970 because he hadn't traveled to 1840 yet in his own timeline of events. I'm dubious when it comes to this one, though, because Roxanne seems to have no knowledge at all of who Barnabas is when she meets him. She could be faking it, yeah, sure, but it just doesn't seem like she is to me. Also, when she was preying on Maggie, like Barnabas mentioned something that like, if he had been the one who had turned her into a vampire, he would have been able to have some connection with her. He didn't seem to sense any connection with her. In fact, he didn't even seem to sense that she was a vampire at all, which is a whole other ball of wax that we can get into, because that's really strange too. Again, I think Gerard/Judah is obfuscating things so that Barnabas can't tell that she's a vampire. But he would have been able to, well, when she was preying on Maggie, he could have summoned her to him, he mentioned, and he's not able to do that because she's not a vampire that he created. So that's why I'm kind of like, I'm not really all in on that idea of Barnabas having been the one to have turned her into a vampire all along in this crazy kind of timey-wimey way that's a paradox. In fact, Kathy Rush wrote a novel called Paradox about Roxanne. So my vote is for Gerard/Judah being the one who made her into a vampire originally. In any case, no matter which path led to it, it seems that Roxanne was always doomed to become one of the undead. So the next couple of questions were posed by writer Sean M. Garrett, who's been doing a Dark Shadows watch through. And after he watches a large chunk of episodes, he usually posts a very in-depth analysis of the episodes that he watched, and he usually tags me on it. So he raised a couple questions which I answered in a post as a reply to his post, but I'm going to bring them up here. He referred to these as kind of dangling plot threads, but I think we can answer these if we just look at the facts. The first question is, why isn't Chris Jennings' brother, Tom Jennings, also a werewolf, even though they're twins? So on the show, they started phrasing things a little slightly differently regarding the curse, the werewolf curse, so that it was the firstborn son who was destined to be cursed. So even though Chris and Tom were twins, Chris must have been born first, making him a few minutes older than brother Tom. Their mother didn't pop them both out at the same time. One came first and then the other one. So Chris, luck of the draw. You got the mark of the pentagram, kid. That's how the curse works. Firstborn son. So the other question regarding 1897, was Angelique really at Collinwood in the original timeline to upset Beth, as we see in a flashback? So this one confused me as a kid when I first watched this. But over the years, I kind of figured out what was going on. And I'm not sure if the writers intended this, but I kind of think they did, actually. I realized that in episode 836, what Beth's ghost is describing to Julia represents an altered version of events. Notice that Beth's ghost is even wearing a different dress than she was originally wearing during the haunting of Collinwood. Barnabas has already altered events in 1897 at this point. And this includes Angelique sticking around Collinwood. Barnabas is there, Angelique sticks around. So Beth's ghost has already experienced a revised version of 1897 by the time her ghost is talking to Julia. And that's what she's describing to Julia. However, I think Quentin's portrait must have been destroyed at this point, or it hadn't been fully completed as far as its powers to bestow immortality. Or surely it would have kept him alive after the shooting. So maybe the portrait wasn't at its full power yet. We have to wonder if the painting already existed in this altered version of events. Why did Quentin die from the gunshot wounds? Would the painting not have absorbed those gunshot wounds? Which also kind of makes you wonder, well, does the portrait just keep him from aging, or does it prevent him from dying from things like a gunshot wound? I think it does protect him from being killed by a gunshot wound. I just don't think at this point, when Beth's ghost is telling Julia the story, that the painting has been painted yet, because it was right at around this time that the painting was completed. So maybe there was like a little bit of a time discrepancy there when she shot him originally, and the painting wasn't fully completed yet, or wasn't at the height of its power yet. At any rate, the audience never got to see the original unaltered 1897. What we're seeing is Beth's ghost describing an altered version of events, which included both Angelique and Barnabas. Okay, next question. How come silver bullets can be used to destroy vampires on Dark Shadows? Isn't that for werewolves? So I've heard this question brought up a few times, just randomly, but in conversation, etc. Okay. Silver bullets are a legitimate method for destroying vampires in some versions. Depending on what vampire movie you're watching, what vampire story you're reading, they kind of tweak things a little bit. They'll pull things from folklore. They'll take their pick or add new things, etc. But the silver bullet is a legit method of destroying vampires in some versions. It wasn't just Dark Shadows. While a silver bullet through the heart is primarily known as the only way to kill a werewolf, the use of silver bullets as a means of dispatching vampires was referenced by clergyman, writer, occultist, and monster expert / fanboy Montague Summers in his book The Vampire, His Kith and Kin in 1928. He said something about certain Slavic countries believing that vampires could be slain by a silver bullet blessed by a priest. And incidentally, Summers wrote all kinds of books about witches, werewolves, and vampires, and translated the notorious witch hunter's manual, the Malleus Maleficorum, into English. And also, Terror at Collinwood listener John Werenius has written a new book on Montague Summers, which is coming out soon. And when that's out, I'll put a link in the show notes to that. Another instance that comes to mind pre-Dark Shadows is Batman destroying vampires with silver bullets in issue number 32 of Detective Comics,
published in 1939. In the second part of the story, Batman versus the Vampire. One of Batman's earliest enemies was a vampire villain called the Monk. So in the story, scours the monk's castle until he finds the coffins housing the monk and Dala, who is also a vampire, and technically the first female Batman villain, Dala, but the monk and Dala are both vampires. So Batman melts down a silver statue and fashions 2 silver bullets, using them to destroy the 2 vampires as they sleep in their coffins. So that is another kind of pre-Dark Shadows example of silver bullets being used to dispatch vampires, in this instance by Batman. Of course, later they kind of retcon things. Well, Batman doesn't use a gun. But in those early Golden Age Batman stories, I mean, this was even pre-Robin, this story, Batman did use guns in some of those early stories. I'm also a Batman fan, by the way. I don't know if I've ever mentioned that on the podcast. I love Batman. But we see silver bullets used on vampires after Dark Shadows as well. In the last Hammer Dracula movie, The Satanic Rites of Dracula from 1973, Peter Cushing's Van Helsing loads a small pistol with silver bullets as part of his plan to destroy Christopher Lee's Count Dracula. And there are other instances as well, but it's definitely a lot less commonly seen than the more well-known wooden stake, sunlight, or decapitation methods. And while the silver bullet has more associations with werewolves, for sure, both in folklore and in fiction, it's considered the metal of purity and technically could be used to harm other types of supernatural beings. Okay, next question. In episode 466, how could Barnabas be rendered unconscious in a car accident if he was a vampire? So we have to remember that Barnabas had been undergoing treatments from Julia for some time at this point. Although Barnabas had put a stop to the treatments, his blood chemistry was most likely still in an altered, kind of hybridized human vampire state, thus rendering him vulnerable, as a human would be, to being knocked unconscious for a time. So I think pre-injection Barnabas, he would not have been knocked unconscious. I don't think anything would have. Remember when Barnabas was getting those injections, he was complaining about how it was weakening him. Because Barnabas is a supernatural being, he's dead. He's one of the living dead. It was affecting his powers, these injections, and he was griping about it, but it was part of being human. You're becoming weaker. So I think with his blood chemistry still in an altered state, he was kind of somewhere in the middle between, he was still a vampire, but these injections weakened him and resulted in him having some human frailties as well. Okay, next question. Why does Josette's music box have 2 different themes? Okay, so there are a couple ways we can look at this. We can look at this as sort of, well, it's really the same theme, you're just hearing it in a different way. It's a retcon, basically. But I kind of like playing with some other ideas here. I know this is a stretch, but what if this is a specially made music box that Barnabas got from the Orient that contained 2 movements? And by using a little switch on the music box, you can play either version of the tune. I kind of like the idea that there's a little switch there that you can switch back and forth between the 2 Josette themes. That's kind of fun. I don't know. I know that's probably not even a thing, but it can be in Dark Shadows. I can already see people rolling their eyes. Well, yeah. Vampires I can buy. Time travel staircases I can buy. A parallel time room. Yeah, that's all right. But a music box that plays 2 songs? That's wicked stupid. Come on. All right, next, let's move on. So this question comes from Michael Wilson in Baltimore, Maryland, who writes, whatever happened to all the blackmail money that Elizabeth Collins Stoddard deposited into a Swiss bank account for Jason McGuire? That's a good question. Either it's still sitting there, Elizabeth didn't get it back, it's just there, sitting in the bank account, or Richard Garner got it back for her. After all that went down, Elizabeth told Richard and Frank Garner about this money that she was being blackmailed to give it to Jason McGuire. Richard Garner is a good lawyer. Maybe Richard Garner was able to finagle things and get that money back for her. That's what I like to think. I hate to think that Elizabeth lost all that money and that's just sitting in some Swiss bank account somewhere. Richard Garner was able to get that money back for her under the circumstances based on what happened here. I don't know if that's a thing that a lawyer can do, but I like to imagine that Richard Garner was able to finagle things and get that money back. Okay, final question here. And this one, I believe, was posted in the Dark Shadows Appreciation Society, and I apologize, I can't remember who posted this question, but I did answer it at the time, and I wish I had made a note of who asked the question. But The question was, in episode 364, the ghost of Sarah Collins says, "Those who were here before have come back, and they're angry. And there's someone in this house they want to destroy." What is she referring to? Who is she referring to? Okay, this is a multifaceted answer here. I think the ever enigmatic Sarah is referring to several things here. Several of the dead who are angry. I think the person in the house they want to destroy is Vicky, is Victoria Winters. Let's start with the first member of the angry dead, Angelique. Angry that Barnabas is free and planning to make Vicky into his new Josette, Angelique would surely want to destroy Victoria. In fact, one has to wonder if it was really Angelique and not Sarah who caused Vicky to get pulled into the past and away from Barnabas. I don't know. It still works. I think it works if Sarah did it, as she claimed, we think that's Sarah possessing Vicky during the seance. Could have been Angelique too. I could see Angelique being the one who pulled Vicky into the past. Number 2, Barnabas, who is technically dead, one of the living dead, and wants Victoria Winters to be his next Josette and vampire bride. This act would, of course, destroy the Vicky we know. Also, Barnabas is intent on destroying Julia at this point. So Julia is someone else in that. So Vicky, I think, comes to mind as the one that they want to destroy, that the dead want to destroy. But Julia too. Barnabas at this point wants to kill Julia. Okay, so Sarah could also be referring to Julia in this instance. I think Barnabas is sort of a key figure here in terms of the dead who want to destroy the living. Next, Joshua. His spirit is angry because Barnabas has been freed from his coffin. I imagine Joshua's spirit being angry and sad, this tragic spirit, that Barnabas has been freed from his coffin, seething in rage and pain from beyond the grave. I think Joshua would be a restless spirit. He wouldn't be one who would want to destroy, but surely one of the angry dead. Number 4, Trask and Abigail. I could put them together here. Angry and destructive and roused because the one who caused their death is free. So Trask and Abigail, they're part of the angry dead here. And then last, Jeremiah. His revenant still haunts the Collinwood estate in 1897, so it stands to reason that he might soon reappear in 1967 with his sights set on vengeance and destruction. This is a loose cannon revenant who shows up periodically. Jeremiah certainly counts as one of the angry dead who would want to harm someone, cause someone harm. So I think the answer is all of the above for me. Sarah's referring to all of these characters, plus maybe a few other ghosts that we don't know about. And I think Sarah, being a little spirit, she sees it all coming like some supernatural tidal wave. She knows it's going to be very bad, so she warns David in the only way she can, as a final desperate effort, knowing what's coming and unable to really verbalize it. You know, Sarah has to speak in these enigmatic sort of riddles. She knows it's going to be bad, though, and she warns her friend David. I think Sarah sees it coming. She can see that other side because she is of that other side. And I think that all of these spirits and Barnabas are all part of this. And that's going to wrap it up for this installment of the Dark Shadows podcast of questions and answers. If you enjoy Terror at Collinwood, do me a favor, please, if you would, like and subscribe to the YouTube channel if you're watching the YouTube version of this, or if you're listening to the audio version of this on either Apple Podcasts or Spotify, particularly those two, please do rate the podcast and review if you get a chance on Apple Podcasts. There is an option to review that does help the podcast to grow and reach more Dark Shadows fans. We're still on Apple Podcasts at 94 reviews, I think. And I'm asking you, if you listen on Apple Podcasts, if you subscribe through Apple Podcasts, let's get those reviews up to 100, at least 100 reviews. I'm asking you as a personal favor, if you're listening right now on Apple Podcasts specifically, please go rate the podcast if you like the podcast. If you don't like the podcast, that's okay. Also, there are other ways to help the podcast. You can donate over at Buy Me a Coffee. That is a great way to help the podcast financially, and any donations go back into the production of the podcast. I do have to pay monthly for the Adobe Editing Suite, which includes Adobe Audition, which I'm using right now, Adobe Premiere for the video version of the episode, Adobe Photoshop, which I use for a variety of things, including making the thumbnails for the YouTube versions of the episodes. There's also an annual fee for Squarespace for the podcast. So all of this stuff adds up, and any donations do help. Also, as I mentioned at the top of the show, there is the new TeePublic shop. You can get Terror at Collinwood t-shirts. TeePublic does get the bulk of that money. I only get a couple of dollars for each of those shirts when they're on sale, and when they're not on sale, I think I get like $4, I think, $3 or $4, and when they're on sale, I get like $2. But that's okay. Every little bit helps, and hey, you get a cool Terror at Collinwood t-shirt with a beautiful illustration by Eric Marshall. So please head on over there, grab a t-shirt, and of course, do not forget to check out all of the great Dark Shadows podcasts out there. There are several. There's Resident of Collinwood, hosted by Jewel T. Sains, and he's often joined by the likes of Patrick McRae, Gordon Demowski, a lot of times Bobby Lugosi joins him. He has a lot of different guests that come onto the show to help co-host. There's Between the Shadows, a Dark Shadows podcast hosted by Kristen Pierce and Cara Tillitz, the Sisters of the Shadows. Check them out. It's a great show. Also, oh my goodness, Alan Gallant, Colin Sport After Dark. He just dropped recently an episode on the teen magazines and Dark Shadows representation in the teen magazines. Gloria Stavers, The Dark Shad Bros, hosted by Peter Mack, DJ Schaefer, and Michael Penzerato. They recently dropped an episode about Catherine Lee Scott, so go check that out. And also there's Dark Paradise, hosted by Rachel Pulliam. That one's about Dark Shadows and Strange Paradise. Also, there's some great podcasts that cover classic horror and Dark Shadows as part of that. And of course, I'm talking about Monster Kid Radio, hosted by Derek M. Cook, often with fill-ins by Steve Turek. There's the Classic Horrors Club podcast, hosted by Jeff Owens and Rich Chamberlain. And of course, the Diecast movie podcast, hosted by Steve Turek. 3 great shows right there with some great hosts, so definitely check those out. And I'm also very excited that my friend Raymond Castile's show, Raymond Castile's Basement of Horror on YouTube, will be returning very soon. You heard Ray back in the 1995 episode discussion, and he's going to be bringing back his show for the new season, so I'm really looking forward to that. Be sure to check out Raymond Castile's Basement of Horror. I do apologize if I'm missing any podcasts here. People are creating really cool content. I know Helen Samaras, a friend of mine who's wonderful, and she's working on a cool new project that I can't wait for her to release. Amanda Desiree just released a new book, which I've mentioned a couple of times already, about her convention experiences attending the Dark Shadows festivals and compiling those convention reports. That's available on Amazon for pre-order right now, and actually you can get it at barnesandnoble.com, I think, right away. I'll put a link in the show notes to that. Also, I'm cutting in with another edition. My friend, the wonderful and amazing Guy Haynes, such a nice guy, and like Helen, has contributed so much to the Dark Shadows fandom over the years. Well, Guy Haynes has a YouTube channel. It's the Belleroguy Guy channel, Belleroguy, and he's had that channel for quite a few years now, but he's been adding more content. Guy was the official videographer at the Dark Shadows festivals, along with the late Dave Brown, and he's been putting up some footage lately from Dark Shadows festivals, Catherine Lee Scott visiting Seaview Terrace, the Dallas Dark Shadows Festival from 1986, An Afternoon with Jonathan Frid. These are all recent additions that Guy has been putting up on his channel, so absolutely subscribe to the Belleroguy channel. It's really cool. It's an archive of Dark Shadows history, so definitely subscribe to that. Thank you so much for listening to Terror at Collinwood. Thank you to everyone who subscribes, listens. Thank you to everyone who rates and reviews the podcast, who subscribes, and even if you don't, if you're just going to the website and listening right off the website, thank you for listening. I sincerely appreciate it, and we'll talk to you next time.
And for as long as they lived, the Dark Shadows never truly vanished, for there will always be Terror at Collinwood. Terror at Collinwood is a Penny Dreadful production.